Welcome back to Reformed Thinking. This is The Deep Dive, where we take source material and, well, we try to get right to the heart of it.
And today, we're looking at a really remarkable figure from the First Great Awakening, David Brainerd.
Specifically, we're digging into his diary, the raw excerpts compiled after his death. We're focusing on the year from June 1744 to June 1745.
Right. And this period it's a sort of the furnace that forged him for his most noted ministry at Crossweek.
Now, for you listening, to set the scene, this is a man who was a missionary to the Delaware Indians in the mid-18th century. He's working pretty much alone under just incredible physical hardship.
And he's attempting a work that even he described as humanly impossible. What's so gripping about this material is that it isn't some sanitized biography. It's a direct, moment-by-moment log of a soul wrestling with his call, with his own body failing him, and with the spiritual darkness all around him.
We're not just reading a historical document today. We're really using Brainerd's raw account to challenge our modern ideas about what a consecrated ministry actually costs.
So for you, this deep dive is going to dissect that reality. We're going to see how crushing sickness and real spiritual anguish didn't just coexist with his work, but were almost prerequisites for the spiritual fervency that came later.
We want to give you a shortcut to understanding the nature of his spiritual striving, measured in, specific prayers and moments of sickness that just laid him out.
Okay, so let's get into it. The first period, from June to early July 1744, we've titled this, Sickness, Solitude, and the Burden of the Call.
And when you open this diary, the sheer physical cost of his life, it hits you right away. It's shocking.
It's the very first thing. He's getting ready to head toward the Delaware region, which is taxing enough, but his body just gives out.
Yeah.
On June 14, 1744, he writes that his pain increased exceedingly, and he was forced right into bed.
And this isn't just, feeling under the weather. He says the following night he was greatly distressed with pain and sickness.
To the point where he says he was sometimes almost bereaved of the exercise of reason by the extremity of pain.
So he's basically delirious. He's in a feverish haze from the pain.
Absolutely. It took an emetic, which is a substance to induce vomiting, just to get some relief. He couldn't even walk outside for days.
And when you think about the conditions he's living in, primitive at best, that level of sickness is terrifying. But his first thought isn't about his own suffering.
No, it's about God's providence. It's amazing. He writes that he often admired the goodness of God, that he did not suffer me to proceed on my journey from this place where I was so tenderly used, and to be sick, by the way, among strangers.
Right. If that were me, I'd be focused on how my plans got wrecked. But he immediately sees the grace in it.
He sees the affliction and the toil, but he also sees the grace that's mixed in with it. The goodness for him wasn't an absence of suffering. It was God placing him in the suffering in a place where he could be cared for, instead of alone in the wilderness.
And this just becomes the backdrop for his work. By Sunday, June 24th, he says he's extremely feeble, even scarce able to walk. But does he take a day of rest?
Not at all. He still visits his Indians and takes, in his words, much pains to instruct them. So you get this picture of a body that can barely move, but a spirit that feels compelled to work. He's physically broken, but spiritually driven by what he calls a burden with the weight and difficulty of my work.
That mental burden, that's a good transition to the next layer of his struggle, which was this wrestling for souls. The scale of the work just seemed impossible to him.
And that's his theological realism. On June 25th, he describes the conversion of the heathen as being as dark as midnight to an eye of reason.
That's not just him being discouraged, that's a theological statement. It's a recognition of total inability, that the human heart on its own is in total darkness.
Right, so if reason only gives you midnight, your reliance has to be somewhere else. He says his whole dependence and hope of success seemed to be on God, who alone I saw could make them willing to receive instruction. That's the necessity of effectual grace right there on the mission field.
But it wasn't just abstract theology. It created very real, practical problems.
It did. On June 26th, he's busy translating prayers into the Delaware language. This is, the basic work of establishing worship.
But he runs into a wall. He says he met with great difficulty because his interpreter was altogether unacquainted with the business.
Think about that. The person he relies on to communicate these deep spiritual concepts has no framework for it. So the problem isn't just the hardness of the Indians' hearts. It's the very mechanics of making the gospel understandable.
So when he hits this kind of wall, physical, linguistic, where does he go for strength?
He connects his own struggle to the grand story of God's work in history. The diary says his faith was much strengthened by observing the wonderful assistance God afforded his servants, Nehemiah and Ezra, reforming his people and reestablishing his ancient church.
Wow. So he takes his tiny, lonely struggle in 18th century America and anchors it in this massive covenantal work of rebuilding God's people after the exile.
It's a great model for ministerial perspective. He sees that his current overwhelming task is just a small piece of God's continuous redemptive plan.
That historical view seems to give him the stability to face his own internal conflicts. Because even with all this theological clarity, his inner state was a mess.
Hmm.
I mean, how does a man so dedicated to God feel, as he writes on July 1st, more brutish than any man?
Well, this constant struggle with sin and feeling inadequate it's a mark of real sanctification in the Reformed tradition. He was perplexed with wandering, vain thoughts. He felt brutish because his mind wouldn't stay fixed on God, and to him, any lapse was a serious sin.
He says he rode to preach that day with a heavy heart, feeling like he had nothing to say.
But then you see this sudden turn, this influx of grace while he's preaching. After a barren half hour, he says, "Soon after I found in myself a spirit of love and warmth and power to address the poor Indians." And God helped him plead with them.
And the people notice.
Yes. He says, "I am persuaded the Lord touched their consciences, for I never saw such attention raised in them before." It's this immediate, powerful evidence that success comes from a sovereign work of the Spirit, not from his own eloquence.
And this external success immediately leads to an internal action. On the ride home, he dedicates himself to God all over again.
He says, "It came into my mind to dedicate myself to God again, which I did with great solemnity and unspeakable satisfaction."
What did that mean for him specifically?
He defines it. It was without any exception or reserve. He wasn't shrinking back from any difficulty. In fact, he was rejoicing that self-denial was necessary for the work. His whole soul was crying out, "Lord, to thee I dedicate myself. O accept of me and let me be thine forever."
Then we see that this spiritual exertion has an immediate and, debilitating physical effect. This is where the diary gets almost hard to believe.
His body was considerably overcome. His fingers grew very feeble and somewhat numb. When he got off his horse, he could hardly walk. He says his joints seemed all to be loosed.
So this is a key thing to grasp. The abundance of the inner man wasn't some peaceful, restful state for him. It was a strength that was actively consuming his physical body.
Yes, he notes the immediate physical breakdown right alongside feeling abundant strength in the inner man. This is a devotion that generates physical symptoms like shock or utter exhaustion.
And that really sets the stage for the next period, where this tension between his breaking body and his determined spirit gets pushed to its absolute limit.
Right. So if part 1 was about the start of the struggle, part 2, from mid-July through August 1744, is the crisis point. This is where he hits new levels of anguish and what he calls absolute mortification.
It starts on July 21st with some devastating news.
Yes, his burden just gets heavier when he hears the Indians are planning an idolatrous feast and dance for the next day. This is direct, open, spiritual opposition to everything he's doing.
He felt he had to do something, but he didn't know what. So he goes to pray. And what follows is one of the most intense descriptions of intercession you'll ever read.
He enters a state of what he calls inexpressible anguish. He pleaded with such earnestness and importunity that when I rose from my knees, I felt extremely weak and overcome. I could scarcely walk straight. My joints were loosed. The sweat ran down my face and body, and nature seemed as if it would dissolve.
He's praying so hard he can't walk straight. That's not just piety. That's his body collapsing under the spiritual pressure. He's wrestling, and his body is the casualty.
And he's so aware that this prayer has to be for God's glory, not his own success. He says he was wholly free from selfish ends, wanting only for God to get to himself a name among the heathen. He even appeals to God, saying that God knew he, Brainerd, preferred him above my chief joy.
Preferring God above his chief joy, which for him would have been seeing people converted, that's the definition of absolute mortification to self.
And if he's truly free from self-interest, what does that do to his view of the world? He says all worldly cares, fears, and desires seemed of little more importance than a puff of wind. Everything, riches, honor, comfort, it just vanishes compared to holiness and the conversion of the heathen.
It even followed him into his sleep. He writes, "While I was asleep, I dreamed of these things, and when I waked, the first thing I thought of was this great work of pleading for God against Satan. His whole being, conscious and unconscious, was enlisted in this fight.
But then what happens when that kind of agonizing prayer doesn't lead to immediate visible results?
That's the temptation he faces the very next day, July 22nd.
Right. He wakes up burdened, he rides over to the Indians, and he actually convinces them to break up their frolic and listen to him preach. But his diary is brutally honest. He says there appeared nothing of the special power of God among them.
So the intense prayer didn't work, at least not in the way he hoped.
And into that vacuum, Satan launches this psychological attack.
Yeah.
The temptations were very specific.
What were they?
There is no God, or if there be, he is not able to convert the Indians before they have more knowledge.
That's a devastating two-pronged attack. First, deny God's existence. Or if he does exist, deny his sovereignty, deny that he can work right now. It suggests God is limited by human ignorance.
He felt very weak and weary, and my soul borne down with perplexity. He had done everything he could, physically and spiritually, and got nothing but temptation in return. But his response wasn't despair.
No, it was determination. He was mortified to all the world and was determined still to wait upon God for the conversion of the heathen, though the devil tempted me to the contrary.
This waiting, this resolve, is what defines what he calls the spirit of a pilgrim. Later that week, he reflects that he had felt this week more of the spirit of a pilgrim on earth than perhaps ever before. The mortification wasn't just a burst of feeling, it was becoming his settled state.
His focus was just completely singular.
Completely. Even when he's traveling west over a hideous mountain, he says, "All my desire was the conversion of the heathen, and all my hope was in God."
As the summer continues, the physical suffering gets even worse. In early August, he enters a season of distressing weakness.
And this is maybe the most psychologically telling part of the diary. He was so worn out that he could neither stand, sit, nor lie with any quiet. He talks about extreme faintness and sickness at his stomach. This is chronic, overwhelming physical distress.
And that physical suffering spills right over into his mental and spiritual state. He says his mind was as much disordered as his body, seeming to be stupid. This leads him to condemn himself. He's perplexed to think that he lived for nothing.
Right, the physical breakdown makes him feel spiritually useless, which creates this kind of existential panic. And he captures it perfectly with this boat analogy.
The boat analogy. Tell us about that.
He saw himself like a man that has all his estate embarked in one small boat, unhappily going adrift down a swift torrent.
That's a terrifying image. So for him, his entire life's work, his estate, is in this fragile boat, his physical body, and it's just being swept away.
And the more consecrated he becomes, the more catastrophic the physical failure feels. But look at his reaction. He says, though his all seems to be adrift, he dare not lament, for this sinks my spirits more and aggravates my bodily disorders.
So he's trapped. Lamenting his spiritual state makes him physically sicker. So what can he do?
He is forced to divert myself with trifles. A man dedicated to the absolute glory of God is forced by his body to do things he considers worthless just to survive the day.
That shows you just how demanding 18th century devotion could be on the body. It pushed him to the absolute limit.
And if part 2 was the crisis, his response was to push even harder into the Susquehannah wilderness. This brings us to part 3, from September to December of 1744.
His health gets a bit better by September, enough for him to be writing again. And he immediately uses that strength to confront a very specific kind of opposition.
Right. On September 2nd, he figures out that some Indians are afraid of conversion, not because of belief, but because they fear they'll be enchanted and poisoned by some of the powwows.
So they're afraid of literal dark magic, retaliation from their own spiritual leaders.
And Brainerd's response isn't an intellectual argument. It's a theological duel. He tells his people he's a Christian and asks them, point blank, why the powwows did not bewitch and poison me.
And then he issues this direct challenge.
A stunningly bold move. He bid a challenge to all these powers of darkness to do their worst upon me first. But the reason why is what's so telling.
What was it?
He didn't want preservation for his own sake. He wanted it for a testimony of the divine power and goodness and of the truth of Christianity, and that God might be glorified. His personal safety was meant to be evidence that Christ's kingdom was superior.
After this, he goes on a long trip to New England and comes back feeling better. But he immediately starts preparing for the Susquehanna wilderness journey.
This starts on October 2nd. He sets out with dear brother Byram, his interpreter, and 2 chief Indians, and they are heading into a hideous and howling wilderness.
The terrain itself sounds relentless. He says they had scarce anything else but lofty mountains, deep valleys, and hideous rocks to make our way through. And then the accident happens.
His horse gets his leg caught in the rocks and falls. Brainerd is okay, thankfully, but the horse's leg is broken, and since they're near 30 miles from any house, he has to kill the animal and go the rest of the way on foot.
Just think about that. It's not just losing your transportation, it's suddenly having to walk 30 miles through that kind of terrain when you're already physically frail.
That night, they make a fire, build a little shelter out of bushes, and lie on the ground. A few nights later, on October 9th, he notes that the wolves howled around us, but God preserved us.
The constant real threat from the natural world just dramatizes the cost of this mission.
When he finally arrives at Susquehannah, at a place called Opohol-Hupon, he presents his case to the king. And surprisingly, they ask him to preach right away.
He preaches twice, feels some freedom, but that initial encouragement fades fast. By October 7th, he was damped by the objections they made against Christianity.
And again, this external resistance triggers internal spiritual dryness. He complains of a want of fixedness and intenseness. He can't keep a spiritual thought focused for even a minute without being distracted.
And this causes him real anguish. He cries out, "Oh, my soul, what death it is to have the affections unable to center in God," and consequently roving after that satisfaction elsewhere. You can hear the struggle for sanctification in that sentence.
After that difficult journey, he gets back and prepares for winter by building himself a home. In early December, he moves into his own little cottage or hut to live alone.
And the first thing he does is consecrate it with a day of fasting and prayer.
Right, on December 6th. And his reasons for the fast are very specific. First, the Indians were worshiping devils. Second, he felt his own spiritual barrenness. And third, he needed grace against the power of some particular corruptions.
It's a tactical spiritual operation.
And during the fast, God gives him a clear conviction of my sinfulness and a discovery of the plague of my own heart. He sees his sin very clearly.
He saw how he would react when he felt God was distant. Either he'd start looking for happiness in earthly things, or he'd get impatient and unsuitably desirous of death. Not because he wanted heaven for God's glory, but because he despaired of doing any good and didn't want to live a life spent for nothing.
He saw his heart as exceedingly polluted, like the nest of vipers. And so his deep desire was to be purified by the blood of sprinkling that cleanseth from all sin. It's a direct appeal to the atoning work of Christ.
The fast ends with this incredible theological insight. Towards night, he feels his soul rejoice, not in his own state, but that God is unchangeably happy and glorious, that he will be glorified whatever becomes of his creatures.
That's the peak of non-self-centered piety. His joy is in God's unchangeable glory, even if the mission fails and he's forgotten.
The next day, though, he's back to feeling inexpressible dejection while preaching, thinking the Indians must hate him.
But despite his feelings, a little sign of grace appears. On December 12th, he finds his interpreter is under some concern for his soul, which gives Brainerd a new care. The conversion of his translator becomes his urgent prayer.
This leads to another day of fasting on the 13th, where he again struggles with pride, with wanting his name to live on.
But then, just a few days later, the breakthrough comes. On December 18th, he's preaching, and his interpreter is amazingly assisted. Brainerd writes, "I doubt not, but the Spirit of God was upon him."
And that change in the interpreter produces a change in the congregation.
Yes. Presently upon this, most of the grown persons were much affected, and the tears ran down their cheeks, and one old man, I suppose 100 years old, was so affected that he wept. It was a specific success that came right after his agonizing intercession.
Okay, so that brings us to part 4, January and February of 1745. And here we see him wrestling with mortality, with mental anguish, and with the growing anticipation of heaven.
The desire for death is a constant theme, but you have to understand why. Back on October 31st, he said his soul longed for death to be loosed from this dullness and barrenness so he could be made forever active in the service of God. He didn't want rest. He wanted liberation for better service.
He was impatient with his own mortality because it kept him from glorifying God fully. But he also makes a distinction between unholy impatience and godly resignation.
He does. On January 14th, he says that when he's in a sweet, resigned frame, he's perfectly willing to live and suffer. But when he lacks that, he's then apt to be impatient to be gone. The ultimate desire was always to be perfect in holiness and in the enjoyment of God.
This pursuit was constantly tested by his health problems, which he called his vapory disorders.
And that term is really key. When he says vapory disorders, he's talking about a set of symptoms we'd probably classify today as severe clinical depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue, a physiological condition that seriously affected his mind and mood.
He describes it on January 27th. He experienced the greatest degree of inward anguish that almost ever I endured. His mind was so confused that while preaching, he'd start a sentence and completely forget what he was saying.
He calls it a degree of distraction.
Yeah.
And notice the cause, occasioned by vapory disorders, melancholy, spiritual desertion, and some other things. He understood that his spiritual struggles were tied to his physical and psychological state. One fed the other.
And this mental anguish hits its lowest point on a Friday, which he reflects on a week later on February 3rd. He calls that experience the wormwood and the gall, or, he says, I might almost say the hell.
The feeling was so bad that it made him long for the grave, unspeakably more than for hid treasures. When he talks about this cup of trembling, we have to see it as the spiritual result of his extreme physical and mental suffering.
He went to preach to the Indians trembling, afraid he would have to drink from that cup again. But even in that terror, he found this rock of assurance.
Yes. He was satisfied that even if not a single Indian was converted, he would still be accepted and rewarded as faithful, for I am persuaded God enabled me to be so.
His acceptance wasn't based on results, but on a faithfulness that God himself enabled.
And that leads right into his next experience with mortification. On February 11th, after visiting a sick man who died, he enters this incredibly solemn frame of mind.
Death becomes very real to him. He says he saw himself as a dead corpse, laid out and dressed for a lodging in the silent grave, but he felt exceeding comfortably. For him, death had no sting.
This clarity led to an universal mortification to all created objects. Riches, honors, pleasures, they all appeared vain and trifling. He said he could picture himself in his coffin, being put into the cold grave with the greatest solemnity, but without terror.
This radical, temporary view of life is summed up by a verse he records that night from 1 Corinthians 7. The time is short, for the fashion of this world passeth away.
And that perspective opened him up to receive real comfort. On February 15th, he's meditating on John 7:37. Jesus stood and cried. It's such a simple, powerful image. Christ openly offering eternal life.
He says he had a sweet sense of the free grace of the gospel. His soul was encouraged, warmed, and quickened. And that clarity on sola gratia grace alone prepared him for what came next.
Just 2 days later, February 17th, he's preaching to a group of white people in the wilderness on that same passage. He felt enabled to imitate Christ, who stood and cried.
He says he was scarce ever enabled to offer the free grace of God to perishing sinners with more freedom and plainness, and you could see the result. There were many tears in the assembly, and he was sure the Spirit of God was there, convincing poor sinners of their need of Christ.
It's a great demonstration that spiritual refreshment and clarity on the gospel paved the way for effective ministry, even right after all that suffering.
Which brings us to Part 5, the spring of 1745. This covers his plans for expansion and his entry into a period of really dramatic public blessing right before he goes to Crossweek.
His years of isolation were taking a toll, and it was time to seek help. On March 21st, he's talking with a minister about how to raise some money among Christian friends in order to support a colleague with me in the wilderness.
He'd spent 2 years in a very solitary manner, and he wanted to follow Christ's model of sending disciples out 2 and 2.
So he takes this long journey to New England to raise the funds. By April 13th, he's back, grateful to God for preserving him and riding full 600 miles, keeping all my bones, that not one of them has been broken, which for him was a major accomplishment.
With the logistics handled, he enters this time of public success, starting at the Abington sacramental occasion on April 20th.
Brainerd preached on Matthew 5:3. Blessed are the poor in spirit. He was given great freedom and tenderness, and he says the assembly was sweetly melted and scores were all in tears. It left him extremely tired, but he was rejoicing.
And the next day, during the communion service, he has this vision of the future blissful communion of God's people when they shall meet at their Father's table in his kingdom. The earthly service gave him a taste of the heavenly one.
He then goes home and prepares for another difficult journey to the Susquehannah, expressing his concern about it because he's still so weak.
And the second trip was even worse. On May 8th, they're caught in a storm, can't make a fire, and were almost ready to perish. And on top of that, their horses ate something poisonous and got so sick they had to walk for miles.
So again, he's on foot in terrible conditions while physically compromised. He travels about 100 miles on the river, preaching to 7 or 8 different tribes.
But his body finally gives out. This journey was too much. He suffers a complete physical collapse. He was seized with an ague, followed with a burning fever and extreme pains, attended with a great evacuation of blood.
He thought he was going to die in the wilderness. He was confined to an Indian trader's hut for a week until he could barely ride again. This wasn't just being sick. It was a near-death experience brought on by the demands of his work.
Yet, despite coming home weak and dejected, this whole period climaxes with an amazing display of God's work at Neshaminy in early June. He went to assist at a large sacramental gathering.
On Sunday, June 9th, Brainerd helps with the Lord's Supper and then preaches extempore with no notes to this huge crowd on Isaiah 53.10, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him.
And the impact was immediate and huge. The sermon was attended with amazing power. There were 3,000 or 4,000 people there, and he says many scores, if not hundreds, were much affected.
It resulted in a very great mourning, like the mourning of Hadadrimmon. That's an allusion from the book of Zechariah, describing a deep national-level lamentation. This massive public blessing, this huge outpouring, happened just weeks after he almost died alone in the wilderness.
After all that intensity, his first need was community. The next 2 days he spent just talking with friends. He writes, "These are the excellent ones of the earth in whom I can truly say is all my delight."
On June 18th, he sets out for Crossweek-Sung, New Jersey. And that's where this year of intense trial and preparation ends, right as he moves toward the place of his greatest spiritual harvest.
This deep dive into Brainerd's year of preparation is so clarifying. There are some really key takeaways here for spiritual life and ministry.
First, you see the necessity of absolute reliance on God. Brainerd always saw conversion as dark as midnight to human reason. Success only came when he consciously placed his whole dependence and hope on God alone.
Second, you see the direct physical cost of his devotion. His most intense spiritual moment, especially in prayer, were followed by his body literally breaking down. The sweat, the loose joints, the collapse. The strength of the inner man was bought at a real physical price.
And third, the role of hardship in stripping away worldliness. Whether it was chronic pain, or the wolves howling, or the anguish of his vapory disorders, these trials made the world seem like a puff of wind and continually recentered him on his heavenly reward.
And this all connects to the Reformed idea of sanctification. His constant war against his own corruption, that feeling of his heart being a nest of vipers, was never separate from his work. He was fighting sin so that he could be qualified to serve.
His perpetual reliance on grace, even in those moments of huge public success, confirms that his faithfulness was measured by his internal striving and his willingness to sacrifice himself physically. The mortification of self was the discipline God used to prepare him.
So we'll leave you with this to think about. What does this whole year of struggle say about the stability of Christian assurance? We heard him say that even when he was physically broken, mentally overwhelmed, experiencing what he called almost the hell, he never had a distressing doubt about my own state and would have cheerfully ventured into eternity.
It forces you to think about sola fide faith alone, in a very practical way. If a man who feels like he's in hell, who is physically unable to even keep his thoughts on God, can still say with confidence that he has no distressing doubt about his eternal state, well, it suggests that assurance must rest completely outside of our subjective feelings, our physical performance, or our mental clarity. It must reside solely in the finished work of Christ. And that in itself is a compelling conclusion to consider as you define the cost of discipleship for yourself.
We'll let you reflect on that. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.